An explosive news conference between President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
We also see eye to eye on Iran. That's the same Iran that tried to kill us both. They tried to kill you, Mr. President. They tried through their proxies to kill me.
Trump plunging the most aggressive possible sanctions on Iran as he restores his maximum pressure campaign.
Drive Iranian oil exports to zero and diminish the regime's capacity to fund terror throughout the region and throughout the world. So this is one that I'm torn about. Everybody wants me to sign it. I'll do that. It's very tough on Iran.
And Trump's plan for the U.S. to take over Gaza. Today, Ambassador John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, joins us for a deep dive.
No, this is just typical Trump confusion. He doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't do grand strategy. He doesn't pursue policy in the way most people understand that terms. It's a lot of conflicting things that exist simultaneously in his mind. The Ayatollahs are on a charm offensive now. Javad Zarif is all over the press. I mean, other American administrations can fall for that kind of approach, but Trump didn't in his first term, and hopefully he won't in the second.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for joining us and for your time.
Glad to be with you.
We've got a lot of ground to cover today when it comes to Iran, the United States, lots of developments this week. But before we get into the analysis, I just first want to ask you, how are you doing?
Well, obviously, the president's decision to withdraw my Secret Service protection was disruptive, as they like to say, and I'm put measures in place in lieu of that. I mean, I think it was a mistake. Trump knows himself. He's the target of the Ayatollahs for the elimination of Qasem Soleimani. There was a Pakistani national arrested at the end of last year for trying to hire a hitman against Trump, as the Revolutionary Guards had tried to hire a hitman against me. And obviously, so a lot of people, Mike Pompeo, Mark Milley, Mark Esper, and others are in the same situation, and I think it was the right thing to do for the Biden administration to afford that protection, and a mistake to withdraw it. But you have to deal with the world as it is, not as you'd want it to be.
You've got a good attitude when it comes to that. And may I ask you, Ambassador Bolton, are you footing the bill for your own security details now?
Well, I'm still working on arrangements for that, but it was certainly, I think, the right thing for the government to provide protection, whether Secret Service in my case or diplomatic security from the State Department for Pompeo and the Pentagon for the Pentagon officials. Nobody's entitled to it, that's for sure. But I think it's a bad signal to the Ayatollahs and to the rulers of other authoritarian states that if they threaten American officials for basically doing their job and can get away with it, it will have an effect on future American officials who will be worried about their own circumstances. What Tehran did with these threats against Trump and all the rest of us really is unprecedented in my experience, and it shows why they're still outside the pale of civilization in the behavior that they engage in. So if they think that they can intimidate the United States, it will simply accelerate the threat, not only for officials, but in the case of the U.S., members of the Iranian American community, the Iranian diaspora, same thing in Europe. It's a very dangerous thing to do.
Now, Ambassador Bolton, do you feel that President Trump then sent a message to the Ayatollahs by doing this? How would you interpret it?
Well, I think he was sending a message as much to his own current aides that if you leave government service and don't say nice things about him, that you could be in jeopardy too. And that's not good management, among other things. But it's intended to have an intimidating effect, and I think it shows a lot about Trump's character, basically.
Now, President Trump said that he's left special instructions to, quote, obliterate Iran if they try and assassinate him. But then on Wednesday, he posted to social media that he wants Iran to be a prosperous nation, that claims that the United States and Israel were going to, bomb Iran to smithereens was an exaggeration, and that he would like a nuclear peace agreement. As his former national security advisor, someone who knows President Trump, is this part of some sort of grand strategy here, or what's the deal? What's going on here?
No, this is just typical Trump confusion. He doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't do grand strategy. He doesn't pursue policy in the way most people understand that terms. It's a lot of conflicting things that exist simultaneously in his mind. And the idea of a bigger deal, a deal bigger than the 2015 nuclear deal, was broached by the Europeans back in 2018 as a way to try and persuade Trump not to withdraw from the 2015 deal, and it would include ballistic missile programs, Iranian support for terrorism. And Trump said he would be interested in that, but that first he wanted to get out of the 2015 deal. I mean, the Ayatollahs don't want to make a real deal on the nuclear program. They absolutely would not make a real deal on the ballistic missile capabilities, and certainly not on their support for terrorism. After the past year plus now with Hezbollah, Hamas very badly damaged, the Assad regime in Syria overthrown, they're really on the back foot at this point. And so I think that Trump talking about a bigger deal is just because he'd be willing to do a deal on almost anything. I think the real key is it's accurate to say there's no disagreement between the people of the United States and the people of Iran. The disagreement's over the regime, and I think the people of Iran are a lot more upset about it most days than Americans, because they have to live under the corruption that's been exposed, the bad economic policies, and the risk they put everybody in Iran in by their aggressive behavior.
Yeah, and after President Trump said that, Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted, quote, there is no such thing as a verifiable nuclear peace agreement with the Iranian regime, who are religious Nazis.
I think the people who negotiated the 25th deal were living in a dream world if they thought they knew everything about Iran's program. And we don't, and to this day we don't. We know an awful lot. We certainly know enough that if the Israelis or the United States decided to destroy it, we would cripple it at a minimum. We know the sites, even those that are deeply buried. The risk is that Iran is doing cooperative work with North Korea in underground sites in North Korea that we're not aware of. So the performance that we need from a government like the one in Iran today, or frankly the government in North Korea, is to be fully open in terms of inspections, which they can't do because it would challenge the very legitimacy of their society. They can't be fully open about anything. So any deal with an authoritarian society, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, is inherently unsafe.
Can you tell us more about these underground sites that you just mentioned for North Korea?
Well, North Korea does more with underground facilities than any country in the world. It's worried about American insight into their activities for a long time, and indeed there were reports in the press that North Korean experts in underground construction had been advising Hamas in the Gaza Strip for this incredible tunnel network that Hamas created there. Maybe the same thing would be true in Lebanon. We know North Korea has cooperated with Tehran on things like the nuclear reactor in Syria that was destroyed by the Israelis in 2007. It was a clone of the North Korean reactor at Yongbyon. And there's been cooperation in ballistic missile work because they're both using the same Cold War era Soviet Scud missile technology. So this cooperation goes back a long way, and the risk that there's cooperation that we have not uncovered, I think, is something we need to be concerned about.
Wow, that's yeah, definitely. Well, let's talk about this memorandum, which before we started taping, you mentioned is a type of executive order here. It tries to block Iran's nuclear ambitions. It's encouraging allies to carry snapback UN sanctions. Of course, the goal of cutting Iran's oil exports, including that to China, down to zero. Given how far Iran has gone in terms of its nuclear ambitions, and the IAEA saying that it's even closer to a nuclear weapon. Does this memorandum or executive order, as it is, go far enough?
No, I think this is simply an effort to restore what happened before the Biden administration in its effort to get back into the nuclear deal, weakened sanctions enforcement and allowed Iran to export a considerable amount of oil and petroleum related products that brought in revenues that enabled it to continue to arm its terrorist proxies and continue to work on ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. I mean, I think there's not going to be peace and stability in the Middle East until the Ayatollahs are replaced. There's no doubt in my mind. I think the real issue right now, and presumably one that Trump and Netanyahu discussed in their private meetings, didn't talk about it publicly for good reason, but is whether Israel now will, at some point in the relatively near future, go after the Iranian nuclear weapons program and try and destroy it. It's certainly very much on their minds. They've got worries about retaliation from Hezbollah's remaining missile arsenal and from Iran itself. But I don't think there's ever been a better opportunity for Israel and the United States to stop this global proliferation threat. It really isn't an Israeli problem. It's a global problem, as is North Korea's nuclear weapons program.
And do you think that they're going to head in that direction, Israel and the United States?
Well, I don't know how the discussions ended up, but this is something that, from a strategic point of view, as long as that threat remains for Israel, it is existential. It's a very small country, half a dozen nuclear weapons. There wouldn't be much left, and this is something that grows more acute as Iran's enrichment capacity expands, but it really exists right now. They could buy half a dozen nuclear weapons from North Korea, which has a number of nuclear devices available, and you'd be in danger in Israel or anywhere around the world subject to terrorist attack on that basis.
Ambassador Bolton, was there anything new in this executive order?
Well, I don't think it was new other than to say the situation is different now 4 years after Trump left office. I'm sure there will be additional steps to come. The real question is not saying at a executive order level, I want the sanctions enforced again. It's really getting them enforced. And I think our experience over the years has taught us that a sanction's best day is the day it's announced, and it gets worse after that because the target takes steps to avoid the effect of the sanction, to mitigate the damage. And honestly, we have not worked as hard as we can to prevent the targets from really escaping the full impact of the sanctions. That's something we need to do because, especially in the case of Iran, it depends on its export earnings from petroleum and related products for the vast bulk of its revenue. If you cut that effectively to zero, it could be a fatal blow to the regime.
Yeah, and I guess one of the criticisms of the Biden administration is that they didn't actually enforce any of the sanctions there. Now, let's talk about China. Would they play ball here?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, look, China is an energy poor country, and getting petroleum from Iran has been critical for them. With the war in Ukraine, of course, now they're buying even more oil and gas from Russia than they did before. That's their preferred method. They're going to expand pipeline capacity directly from Russia overland into China. They don't have to load oil in the Persian Gulf and risk shipping it through the Indian Ocean that way. Uh, but they still need a lot more oil, and Iran is the most logical source. They're actually building Chinese are building a facility in Pakistan so that oil from the Middle East can be offloaded there and then shipped by pipeline north through Pakistan and then east to the coast of China. So they remain very worried, and that's why I don't think there's any realistic possibility China or Russia would agree to put pressure on the Ayatollahs at this point.
And are any of the Gulf Arab states What are their feelings with regards to this pipeline that's going to go through Pakistan?
Well, I think they are reluctant to give up the China market as a possibility, but I think they see that China and the West are coming into an increasing period of confrontation economically and politically. So they need to be very concerned about the existing American sanctions. I think the Gulf Arab states would welcome the elimination of Iran's nuclear weapons program, and frankly, they'd welcome the overthrow of the regime because they are threatened by Iran's terrorist surrogates, just as Israel is. The Iranian ring of fire strategy around Israel also works against the Gulf Arab states, and in particular, if you look at the Houthi rebels in Yemen, they're in Saudi Arabia and UAE backyard, and it's one thing to have to face Iran across the Gulf, but to have missile launching sites in your backyard, which have been used against Saudi and Emirati civil airports and oil facilities over the years. The threat's not hypothetical, it's real.
And you mentioned Ukraine before. Trump says he wants to end the war in Ukraine. And given the strategic partnership between Russia and Iran and Vladimir Putin's relationship with President Donald Trump, how would this impact Iran?
Well, I'm very worried that the war in Ukraine could end in a very disadvantageous way for Ukraine. I think Trump has made it clear he wants both the Middle East war and the war in Ukraine to disappear. He said they wouldn't have happened if he had been elected president, which is a statement that's neither provable nor disprovable, but he says it's Biden's fault, basically. And it also implies, especially in the case of Ukraine, he doesn't care on what terms the war is ended. He just wants it over with, which I think is dangerous for the Ukrainians. And if there were a ceasefire in Ukraine and there were some kind of negotiations, I think it would take the pressure off Iran and obviously off Russia as well. So it could lead to more trouble in the Middle East because the concern and the resources having to be expended in Ukraine would at least have been suspended.
So this would embolden Iran in some shape or form.
I think there's a risk of it. The fact is, Iran's proxies have taken a terrible pounding. I mean, Hamas and Hezbollah have suffered damage that would have been inconceivable just a short time ago, but they're not eliminated yet. And in Syria, although the Assad regime is gone and a new group has taken over, unfriendly to Tehran, this new group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is not clear to me anyway that it really has renounced its terrorist origin. So the last thing that any of us need is a new terrorist state on the shore of the Mediterranean. That remains a very, very unstable and worrisome situation there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unfold in the Middle East. Now, when Trump was signing this executive order on Iran, he said, quote, "This is one that I am torn about. Everybody wants me to sign it. I'll do that. It's very tough on Iran." Now, there's a lot of debate. Some people were saying that he wasn't tough on Iran when he was saying things that, I'm torn about it. What's your take on it? Why would he say something like that? What kind of message is he trying to send?
Well, I think there's a risk with Trump that he'd negotiate anything with anybody, and the idea that he believes he's the best deal maker in the world. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. Is something that should trouble us because he doesn't really understand fully what's at stake here. And the Ayatollahs are on a charm offensive now. Javed Zarif is all over the press saying they want to have negotiations. Uh, it disguises, I think, how fundamentally weak the regime is internally. I think it's at its weakest since the revolution of 1979. And it wouldn't take too much to see the regime fragment at the top. I think that's one reason they want to try to get another nuclear agreement in place so that they can get off the sanctions, then violate the agreement and proceed to nuclear weapons. The idea, obviously, is to have the best of both worlds, and that's what we should resist.
Speaking of this charm offensive, we've got the president of Iran and Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, saying that if President Trump just wants us to halt our nuclear ambitions, this should be achievable and easily done. Now, of course, we need to balance that by saying that still Iran hasn't been able to explain its past secret activities and the IAEA says that they're closer to a nuclear weapon. What do you make of all of this in terms of that charm offensive that you just mentioned?
Well, there's no evidence whatever that Iran has made a strategic decision to give up nuclear weapons. What they want is to be freed from the sanctions and the fear of an Israeli or Israeli-American attack on the nuclear program itself. So they'll say almost anything to buy time, to try and buy security. And they were very successful with the Biden administration to have protracted negotiations in the first 2 years of the Biden administration in particular, while the sanctions enforcement dissolved, and they were able to get somewhat back on their feet economically. I mean, other American administrations can fall for that kind of approach, but Trump didn't in his first term, and hopefully he won't in the second.
And now, the 2025, the Middle East is very different than Trump's first administration. You've got Assad out. You've got Iran's air defense systems completely knocked out by Israel. You've got Iran's proxies severe. They're not out, but they're severely weakened. So it's a very different Middle East than 2016. Do you suppose that Trump is going to go back to the president he was in 2016, or are you going to see a different version of Trump this time around?
Well, since he has no underlying philosophy, there's really no telling what direction he's going to go in. And I think one important question we don't know the answer to is what consumes his attention first? Is it the war in Ukraine, or is it more work on the Middle East? The administration said yesterday that they had made progress in some preliminary talks on Ukraine, and I think there is a feeling that some kind of negotiated outcome is possible there. So it could be Ukraine distracts his attention. Certainly, Trump has a lot going on domestically that's going to distract his attention. So I'm not sure how much of a priority he will make. I have no doubt he discussed that with Netanyahu during Netanyahu's visit, both with respect to Gaza and Lebanon, but also the Iranian nuclear program.
Now, if diplomacy fails, is there a way to ramp up the maximum pressure campaign and the executive order that's already out? What other options does the U.S. have?
Well, I think that, as I said before, the regime is very weak internally, and there are ways of providing resources for the opposition. I think the regime will be particularly vulnerable when the Ayatollah Khamenei, who's 85 thereabouts and not in good health, passes on. That's when the succession, which has only happened once in the Islamic Republic, they've only had two supreme leaders. So this is hardly a guaranteed path to name a new leader. That's where you could see fragmentation at the top within the Ayatollahs, within the Revolutionary Guard and the conventional military. And if the people at that point began to come out on the streets, I think that regime is a lot more fragile than people think.
And just to conclude, Ambassador Bolton, Donald Trump's plan for Gaza, with the U.S. A plan to rebuild Gaza and have neighboring countries pay for it. What impact is this going to have on Iran, given Iran's relationship with Gaza and Iran-backed Hamas, and also their alleged aggressive activities now in the West Bank?
Right. Well, I think there are two issues that Trump has raised. One is exactly what the American role will be. I think the chances are between slim and none that the U.S. will take control of the Gaza Strip or even participate in the rebuilding. The real issue is what to do with the residents of Gaza who have lived in a high-rise refugee camp for a long time. It's not an economically viable strip of territory as long as there's turmoil in the Middle East. Maybe someday it can be another Riviera, but that's a long way away. And in the meantime, you get 2 million people in Gaza that have to be accommodated. I think the real humanitarian answer is resettlement, because if you simply rebuild Gaza, you're going to recreate all the problems that led to October the 7th. So I would abolish UNRWA, the Palestinian agency. I'd have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees come in to take over certainly the Gaza refugee problem and see if there's not a workable solution. And, those who still support Hamas, maybe they can go live in Iran where they get so much of their resources anyway.
But does a plan like this, does this benefit Iran in any way? Can they use this to their advantage or not, or is it the opposite?
Well, I think a lot of radical factions in the Middle East can use this dissatisfaction because the poor Palestinians have been victimized for so long by propaganda from the radical Arab states going back to the 50s and 60s that they're going to go back to Israel. They're not going to go back to Israel. The High Commissioner for Refugee doctrine is refugees should not stay in refugee camps. It's a terrible place to be if you've ever been in one. It's just a dead existence for people. They want to have a home. They want to have a productive life. These people are not going to go back to their country of origin, which is Israel. That's not going to happen. Every other refugee population in the world since 1945, under those circumstances, has been resettled. And so it's a humanitarian gesture to try and do that, so that the people and their families have a chance to be in a functioning economy with a future. Their children can go to schools and look for something other than living in a high-rise refugee camp with no future to look forward to.
And in some ways, does this plan distract the United States from the issue of Iran's nuclear program?
Well, I think everybody gets distracted by things like the hostage crisis, like the terrorist proxies. The center of all this is in Tehran, and until you deal with the Ayatollahs, these other manifestations of their effort to have hegemony in the Middle East and hegemony within Islam are not going to go away. If there were a new regime in Tehran tomorrow, it wouldn't guarantee peace and stability in the Middle East for sure, but it would go a long, long way.
And any final thoughts? Do you feel that in any way Trump is sending a weak or a strong message to Iran in your assessment?
Well, I think he's sending a confused signal, and that's so we'll now see what the Iranian response is. It is going to be a very difficult period. I think there are many challenges that the U.S. faces around the world, and there's a question for any president, but especially an incoming president, if he has the capacity to deal with it all at once. We could see a challenge by China for its own purposes in the South China Sea that could become a crisis very quickly. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot going on domestically for Trump too. It's a very busy period, and that's always a risk.
And as you mentioned before, that confused signal comes from a lack of philosophy in your view and not some sort of grand strategy here.
Yeah, I can assure you there's no grand strategy. It's sort of what comes into his mind at any given time.
Thank you so much for your time, Ambassador John Bolton.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, hit the like button, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.